Ken Levinson, and on the behalf of the Board of Directors of WITA, we're pleased to welcome you all here today for the third of our 10-part series looking at the NAFTA. This is already our second event in October. Yesterday we hosted Secretary Sonny Perdue, and we'll be holding 4 more events this month, including looking at the GSP program, which is up for renewal this year. Information on that is in the handouts that we gave out earlier on your way in. I'll be holding 3 more NAFTA-related educational events before the end of the year, including a speech by Lance Fritz, the CEO of Union Pacific Railroad, on October 19th to kick off an event we're going to be doing on North American supply chains. We know about a third of our audience here today have series passes for the NAFTA series, and we'd like to encourage, if others of you are planning to come to future events, we adjust the pricing down when we have fewer events. So for those of you who got it at the beginning of the series, you could get 8 events to get all 10 events for the price of 8. After this, we'll have 7 more events. We'll get those for the price of 5, and you can use those within your organization. So you can transfer that if you can't attend yourself, or your colleagues can attend. In addition to our NAFTA series, later this month we're hosting an FDA boot camp to discuss requirements for exporting FDA-related products, as well as the Food Safety Modernization Act. And lastly, this month we have a very special one-time event. It's a trade community-wide event that WITA has pulled together with the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber, the National Foreign Trade Council. This is to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the signing of the GATT, which I'm not sure if everybody else is focused on, but we're looking at it's 70 years since all these institutions that were created after the war, the UN, NATO, the GATT, and the precursors for the European Union. All these things were set in motion 70 years ago. We're going to have a special celebration of the GATT for the trade community. Information on that should be landing in your inboxes today. So thank you to all the folks who are part of that event. To find out more about that, please talk to Diego Anez or myself. I'm going to turn the stage over to our panel now. I'm very grateful to all of them for their willingness to join us today, especially and including Elaine Feldman, who flew in from Canada yesterday so she could join us. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you to Chip, David, and Matt for joining us. After each of our panelists makes remarks, we'll have a discussion among them, and then we'll go to Q&A with the audience. Thank you. Chip? Okay. Thank you. We'll start.
Do I need?
Yes, you need the handheld mic. Pass this
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, it's very nice to be here. I retired 3 years ago, so I don't often get out to downtown, and especially at this very early hour. So you all have my sympathies for still being on the job. My principal qualification to be the moderator is that in a panel on NAFTA is that I was there when we created the NAFTA. In fact, I was there when we created the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And our subject today is the Chapter 19 and Chapter 20 of the NAFTA. Both of those chapters really were based very heavily on the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And by coincidence, it's 30 years ago this week that we concluded, in a manner of speaking, at least the conceptual agreement on the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, including Chapter 19. And I thought before I send you off to the panel, I would just note the history of that very briefly. The U.S.-Canada Free Trade negotiations, perhaps the biggest Canadian ask was that they wanted to they wanted to be exempted from the U.S. trade remedy laws and have them have the problems of subsidies and dumping to a certain extent dealt with by rules that would be in the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement on when you could subsidize and so forth. And those rules were to be, in Canada's ask, were to be enforceable by binding dispute settlement. So there would be binational panels who would decide whether or not a disputed practice was an illegal subsidy, for example. This was this was 1986 and 1987, and that was for the United States, that was a bridge too far. There was a lot of support for the idea of a U.S.-Canada free trade agreement in the United States and in Congress, but the lobby or the industries that saw CVD and dumping laws as very beneficial for them were adamant that we were not to give up those laws. This resulted in a bit of an impasse. Well, not a bit of an impasse. On I believe it was September 20th of 1987, Canada walked out of the negotiations because they felt the United States was just not being responsive on to Canadian concerns on trade remedies and dispute settlement. That did have the desired effect, I think, of getting very high level attention in the U.S. government for Canada's concerns, but it didn't change the fact that the message we were getting from Congress was it would be impossible to give Canada an exemption from those laws. But kind of the last minute save on all this was a proposal that I think it came out of Congress that or some congressman saying, well, how about we give them binding dispute settlement, but we don't give them an exemption from our laws. Instead, we give them binding dispute settlement that replaces our courts and reviews countervailing duty and anti-dumping decisions against Canadian products, and vice versa, it must be said. So that's what became Chapter 19 of because in consulting in Congress and with the constituencies, it was clear that this was viewed as a U.S. concession, but not as awful a concession as the various proposals that had been floated for making exceptions for Canada from the law. So that's what was put in. Chapter 20 was, I don't think it was even Chapter 20 at that time, but the other dispute settlement, what became Chapter 20 in NAFTA, was much less controversial. It was basically both countries wanted, the thinking was you needed a way to resolve your disputes and not let the other guy get away with violations. At the time, Congress was very enthusiastic about strong dispute settlement because we'd had a lot of frustrations with the blocked up process in the GATT, which I was very familiar with. I argued about a dozen of those cases, and it was indeed very frustrating to have a great triumph and then nothing happened afterward by way of compliance. So then fast forwarding to NAFTA, Mexico had very similar demands. They wanted exceptions from the CVD and dumping laws and so forth, and basically said, well, if you're not going to give us any of that, you've at least got to give us what you've given to the Canadians. And Canada made very clear that the price of them being in NAFTA was too, that we had to carry on with Chapter 19. And so once again, that was, it was folded in. I will say that there wasn't much enthusiasm for the U.S., for Chapter 19 in particular, but it was considered worth the price of the FTA and then the NAFTA. And the FTA, it should be said, passed about 96 to 4 and 410 to 8 or something like that. It was nearly unanimous in Congress. So obviously it didn't have the the level of controversy that at least the current administration goes through. Anyway, that's kind of the background. We've got a panel that knows much more recent stuff that is going to be much more useful to you. You've got their bios, but let me just note, Elaine Feldman is one of the founding fathers or mothers of dispute settlement in Canada, and she's particularly well qualified. She is not tainted with NAFTA, but she was busy doing what became the Uruguay round agreements while we were doing NAFTA. And now, I guess, after a long career in the Canadian government, she's in a think tank, which is always a good thing to do. David Yocis is a lawyer at, I'll get your firm, the Rowe part of it is the only thing I can remember.
Picard, Kentz, and Rowe.
Yes. in private practice. They misspell the Rowe, but that's all right. And he was also at USTR. He was also at USTR, sorry. I'm used to these. And Matt Gold, who also has had a stint at USTR and has chaired a Chapter 19 panel, but now is a professor at Fordham Law School. Anyway, I thought I'd start out with Elaine, who I've asked to lay out the basics of how Chapter 19 and 20 work, as well as giving the Canadian perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chip. As Chip says, I wasn't there for the Canada-US FTA negotiations or for the NAFTA negotiations. But before I talk about Chapter 19 and 20 more generally, I think it's really important to pick up on some of what Chip said and give you a bit of the context about why Chapter 19 is so important to Canada and why it's such an important part of the NAFTA negotiations that are ongoing. So, to put things in context, Canada is very much a trading nation. We are an export-dependent country. For the last 25 years, a third of our GDP has come from Canadian exports, and we import roughly the same amount, and that's just goods. So when you think about all the changes in trade in recent years in terms of the importance of services and the digital economy and value chains and so on, think about if a third of your GDP comes from the export of goods. And where do most of our exports go? To the United States. Despite a very long history of trying to diversify our trade, over 75% of our exports still go to the United States. So if you go back to the original Canada-US free trade negotiations, which were extremely controversial in Canada, and we ended up having an election that really turned on whether we should proceed with a free trade agreement with the United States. It was critical from the Canadian perspective to ensure that we protected our market access into the United States. And that was the reason behind the importance that Canadians negotiators put on ensuring or trying to get the United States to look at its trade remedy laws. And we got stonewalled. I say we, but I'm taking the we is the Canadian we, and based on what the negotiators at the time have said. And so eventually, as I understand it, the United States just refused to discuss these issues. And so eventually Canada walked out of the negotiations. And that really got American attention, as Chip says. And so the proposal came forward, which eventually became what we know as Chapter 19. And this was Chapter 19 of the original Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And it's become so iconic in Canada that it had to be carried over into the NAFTA as Chapter 19. The numbering of the chapters had to make sure that 19 stayed 19. You couldn't go from Chapter 19 of the Canada-US FTA to a different number for the NAFTA. So what is Chapter 19? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. It is a system in which each country
Just close to your mouth.
It's a system in which each country maintains its own trade remedy laws, but it provides for binding dispute settlement in anti-dumping and CVD duty matters. So it means that the exporter can appeal a final determination of CVD or AD. They can appeal either the Department of Commerce's findings, determinations of anti-dumping CVD, or they can appeal the ITC's determinations of injury or threat of injury, or both, or all three. And I have some experience, and we don't, I hope, get sidetracked by softwood lumber, but in Lumber 4, Canada appealed the CVD, the AD, and the threat of injury in NAFTA Chapter 19 panels. So what happens? The panel reviews whether the determinations that the investigating authority has made are in accordance with the domestic law of the importing country. So, fairly straightforward. But the important thing is that panel decisions are binding. There is no appeal mechanism. There is instead an extraordinary circumstances review, the Extraordinary Challenge Committee, the ECC. And what happens if a panel determines that a duty is not in accordance with the law of the domestic law? It remands it back to the investigating authority. I think, again, that's really important to remember that it's not, for the most part, a panel making its own determination on the record in front of it, but it's saying that on the basis of this, that clearly either it affirms the decision or it sends it back for remand. But the really important thing from the Canadian point of view is that if on remand it's just the investigating authority has improperly applied its own legislation and duties have been improperly collected, then the duties are refunded. And duties mount up quickly and can amount to real money. And certainly in the last softwood lumber case, by the time the agreement was reached, duties collected in the AD and CVD cases amounted to about $5 billion. And so that becomes real money and becomes a real issue. And that's an important thing to remember when you compare Chapter 19 with the dispute settlement provisions of the WTO. Because the WTO doesn't provide for refund of duties that were improperly collected. The WTO is really a dispute settlement mechanism that provides for prospective application. So it tells a country that's applied that's taken a measure that's not consistent with WTO obligations to bring itself into conformity. So it's going forward, but there's no refund of duties. And it's one of the reasons, a key reason, that Canadian exporters have traditionally been such fervent supporters of Chapter 19 in their view that duties have been improperly collected and there's a chance to get your money refunded under NAFTA rather than taking a dispute to the WTO. So that's perhaps a very long-winded explanation of why Chapter 19 is so important to Canada, but it remains a critical element of the Canadian position. And I have to say, as an outsider, and I'm not connected with the federal government, that I get very worried when I see that one of the U.S. objectives for the NAFTA renegotiations is the elimination of Chapter 19. It's not about improvements to Chapter 19. It's not about looking at the application of trade remedy laws, except to preserve the ability of the U.S. to enforce vigorously its laws. It's about the elimination of Chapter 19. And I wonder, and this again, it's a personal observation, is this a real negotiation, or is it just an attempt by the United States to make it easier to restrict imports from Canada and Mexico? I hope it's a true negotiation in which each party recognizes that there needs to be flexibility, that no one party is likely to achieve all its objectives, and that account has to be taken of each party's bottom lines. And for Canada, that clearly means the retention of Chapter 19. As our Prime Minister has put it, a fair dispute resolution system is essential for any trade dispute that Canada signs on to. I hope the U.S. negotiators take note. And I have to say also that Chapter 19 has taken on much more resonance in Canada over the past year or two. And that's largely because, while there's been a dearth of Chapter 19 cases since the last lumber dispute, in the last year or so we've seen two major cases. The first, of course, is the perennial softwood lumber case, where Canadian exporters of softwood lumber to the U.S. are facing combined AD and CVD duties in the range of 27%. And the second is the recently announced preliminary determination of a CVD against Bombardier, a Canadian airplane maker, of almost 220%. And that's before the determination of the preliminary anti-dumping duty. So I don't know, maybe somebody else does, whether there's ever been a duty as high as a CVD duty as high as 220%.
Oh, sure.
Okay, well, for Canadians, this is...
You guys are fighters.
So that's the context, I think, that it's important to remember going forward in these NAFTA negotiations. And as for Chapter 20, as Chip said, that's the general dispute settlement provision of the agreement. It really hasn't been used very much. To my knowledge, there's only been one case between Canada and the United States, and that was in the very early days of NAFTA. And I can't speak for Mexico, but I think there have only been a couple of cases. And the other interesting thing about Chapter 20 is it gives the complaining party the discretion to choose whether to go to the WTO or to the NAFTA if the dispute falls under the NAFTA and WTO rules. And in recent, well, really since that one dispute, Canada and the United States have chosen to bring their disputes to the WTO rather than use NAFTA Chapter 20. But as we look at a renegotiated NAFTA, and particularly a NAFTA that may contain rules that go well beyond what is contained in WTO obligations, I mean, it's clear we're dealing with things like e-commerce and the digital economy and potentially intellectual property and various other obligations that will go further than what's contained in the WTO. It will be much more important to have a Chapter 20 that's efficient, transparent, and effective. Thank you.